Okay, good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. This is a shift, a transition in this series insofar as now we're discussing events that I remember personally, right? Not stuff I know from books. I actually remember some of these things happening, and so I don't know if that makes it more reliable or less reliable, but it's certainly different for me to speak about things that I recall. I think before we tell the story and sort of jump into the historic narrative, I think it's worth taking some time to learn a little bit of Torah and some halakha, and so just like kind of talk about the theory of women's Tefilah groups and how they operate and operated, and what some of the halakha controversy about them is about, and so let's just sort of again as just from square one or whatever square it is, right? Men and women are both obligated to perform mitzvot. They both have mitzvot aseh, positive mitzvot. They both have mitzvot lo taseh, prohibitions. But there are some gendered mitzvot in the Torah. Some mitzvot that are only for men. Some mitzvot that are only for women. For example, right? So what would be like a Tefillin, okay, that's an awkward example. So a better example, I don't know, what's a fine example? But what? Brit Milah is a great example. Brit Milah is a great example, right? Any ways to figure any rules, about, that you might, okay, so mitzvot aseh, these are positive, time-bound mitzvot, and are women obligated in those or not? Not, okay? Women are exempt, the Talmud tells us, from positive, time-bound mitzvot. So here's the curious thing. The curious thing is that there are more exceptions to that rule than cases that meet that rule. And I have on page 3, this is a footnote from an article that Rabbi Saul Berman wrote in the 70s. And just if you look at footnote 10, 11, 12, and 13. So footnote 10 on page 3, these are positive, time-bound mitzvot that women are exempt from. So it's 8 examples. Reciting the Shema twice a day, because reciting the Shema in the morning and in the evening, positive, time-bound mitzvot. Binding tefillin on the head, binding tefillin on the arm, because those are mitzvot during the day. Although that's not exactly time-bound. It's a little, the Gemara. It's complicated in the Gemara, so maybe it's a different reason why it's. Wearing tzitzit is a positive mitzvah, because it's usually where the mitzvah towards tzitzit is only during the day. Counting the Omer, it's a positive time-bound mitzvah. Living in a sukkah, taking the lulav and etrog, hearing the shofar. Okay, so either 6 or 8 mitzvot 8 mitzvot women are exempt from. 6 of them are positive time-bound mitzvot. Footnote 11, these are 6 mitzvot that women are exempt from that are not time-bound at all. Okay, so study of Torah. For the king to write a sefer Torah, for Kohanim to bless the people, procreation, having children, and for a groom to celebrate with his wife for a full year, and circumcision of sons. That's not, even though even though it's done on the 8th day, it can be done after the 8th day, right? Exactly, right. Good, exactly. Footnote 12, these are positive time-bound mitzvot that women are obligated to perform, such as Kiddush on Shabbat, fasting on Yom Kippur, eating matzah on Pesach, rejoicing on the holidays, assembling once in 7 years, sacrificing, eating the Korban Pesach. Okay, these are positive time-bound mitzvot, nonetheless women are obligated. And footnote 13 are rabbinic positive time-bound mitzvot that women are obligated to perform, and they are lighting Hanukkah candles, reading Megillat Esther, drinking 4 cups of wine on Pesach, and reciting Hallel on Pesach. Okay, so. Right, exactly. So it's the reason why it's worth so once you go through that exercise is just to see that there is the rule is found in the Gemara, positive time-bound mitzvah, but there are more exceptions than cases that fit the rule. So it's a strange rule, right? And you should be wary to learn too much from it, because you have to be cautious if you want to build an entire theory of what it means to be a Jewish femininity based on a rule that has more exceptions than cases that it describes, right? That would be, you have to be cautious to do that. What's not on this list? What's a mitzvah that doesn't seem to be gendered in any way in the Torah? Okay? Tefilah, good. Thank you. excellent. Right, prayer is not on this list. Okay, so it seems that women have an obligation to pray. And the most basic way to understand the Talmudic evidence is to say, and as many poskim, and halakhic codes have indeed said, women's obligation to pray is equal to that of men. Women have obligation to pray certainly Shachrit and Mincha every day, and probably maybe even Marav too, but certainly Shachrit and Mincha every day. And that's like your simplest, safest. That's like best practices. Is women should pray Shachrit and Mincha every day. Why not Marav too? It's true, historically, many women didn't, and you have some of the Achronim in the last several hundred years writing, like the Magen Avraham famously looked around and said, doesn't seem like women are davening, I wonder why, and he came up with an excuse. Maybe women aren't obligated to daven. But the simplest, that's a post-fact, that's sort of looking at the evidence, like these are pious, our community is pious, and we talked about Mimetic Judaism, right? If you're in an intact traditional society, then a very strong piece of evidence for what the Torah demands of you is looking around and seeing what Torah observant Jews are doing. It seemed that women weren't davening, so the Magen Avraham wrote a commentary explaining why that could be justified. But without that need to justify that practice, women seem to be obligated in prayer. Women are not part of a minyan, though, right? So women don't comprise a minyan. A minyan in the codes is 10 men, but women who pray with a minyan are doing, according to many opinions, are doing the same mitzvah that men are doing. They're praying with the Tefilah b'tzibur, which is an enhancement of the mitzvah of prayer. Right? There's like praying level 1, and there's praying level 5. Right? That's prayer with a minyan. Okay, it's like a better way to do the mitzvah of prayer, and that would be, and a woman who prays with a minyan would be doing that same mitzvah as a man who's praying with a minyan. It's like the mitzvah of prayer in an exemplary way, hidur mitzvah, like an enhancement of the mitzvah of prayer. And man number 11, 12, 13, 14, 103 who walks into shul, and a woman who walks into shul, they're doing the same mitzvah. They're praying with the tzibur. Even though the first 10 men are the ones who create the minyan, everyone who shows up on time to say the Amidah together is fulfilling that mitzvah of praying with the minyan.
So it's a human chiv.
Yeah, for the men too, it's probably, it's not a, right? I mean, the language of the Shulchan Aruch is yishtadel adam, right? A man should try to pray with a minyan when he can, but that's not an obligation to pray with a minyan for any individual man. And there are other, as we'll see, there are other values, other enhancements of the mitzvah of prayer that might be worth more than prayer with a minyan. For example, praying at sunrise, right? So if you have a choice between praying at sunrise or waiting an hour and praying with a minyan, maybe it's better to pray at sunrise. Okay? However, there are certain mitzvot, right, that women do comprise a minyan for, okay? Like mitzvot that women, that pertain to like things in public that women are equally obligated in that mitzvah, that women do perform the mitzvah for. So there are two examples of that. There's the mitzvah of martyrdom, okay? You have to be willing to die rather than violate mitzvah of the Torah if it's in public, and that's defined as 10 Jews. And if there are 10 women, that's the same obligation, right? So everyone wants to say Baruch Hu, nobody wants to be a martyr, but nonetheless, that women count for a minyan when it comes to martyrdom. It's so too, I believe, Birkat HaGomel can be said in front of 10 women, and so too the extra bracha of Mikra Megillah. Women are obligated in the mitzvah of Megillah, and so 10 women can say the minyan bracha after reading Megillah. Okay, women have that's okay. Another issue that is discussed when pertaining to women's Tefilah groups and reading from the Torah is whether there's a prohibition of women to carry a Torah scroll or touch a Torah scroll. There were some customs in certain communities that women in Nida, menstruant women, didn't go to shul, didn't recite brachot, didn't look at a Torah. That existed in certain Ashkenazi communities at certain times. That's not normative halakha. There's an ancient text called Breita de Nida, which is the source of many of these customs, and the current scholarly consensus is that it's not a rabbinic book. Like it was written by it's Hebrew. It's an ancient Jewish text that was from people who did not accept the rabbinic system because it contradicts the Mishnah, which says that a Torah scroll is not susceptible to Tumah. And so there would be no reason why somebody, a Zav or a Zava, a man or a woman who's Tameh, shouldn't handle or touch a Torah scroll. And there are also some historic precursors as well of women's Tefilah groups. For example, like in girls' schools, when there's a chazanit who leads her class in Shachrit, on a Wednesday morning, that's sort of like, right, she might lead certain parts of Tefilah out loud to help keep pace, and this is something which is pretty common in Beit Yaakov's and has been since the beginning of girls' education. That would be a way of women not in the presence of men, not in the context of shul, to pray together in a group. There were also places in Europe where there were women's synagogues, which were adjacent to the main synagogue, and there were women who led other women in prayer in the women's synagogue. And you can find, the mechitzas back then were like, whatever, they're like walls, like stone walls, like 6 inches thick stone walls with maybe a little window, maybe not. And so women would gather for prayer in the women's shul, and there would be a woman who would lead them in prayer and help them keep pace, etc. So that also is a precursor of women's tefillah. And there's even Rav Masas writes about women even reading the Torah with other women who are reading from the Torah scroll. So there is some precedent for that as well that happened. It's not like just a modern thing, this is an old thing. So, what? Rav Masas writes about it. He was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Haifa in the 1950s, I think.
But that would have meant that they're literate.
Yeah, so some places women were literate, right? Some places they were, some places they weren't. I mean, I think that, Jewish history is very long and variegated. So maybe in Morocco in the 17th century they were, and maybe in Yemen in the 19th century they weren't. I really don't know, but like different places, the different things were. Yes?
When Moroccan women read from the Torah, what was the procedure?
I think they're just, I don't know. They would not with bracha, presumably, but they would.
With cantillation?
I imagine so. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't have the. He's quote. The Frimmer Brothers article on women's tefillah groups contains a citation from him, so you can look it up. And I don't. It's in the other room. So I think at this point, so let's talk now about some of the history, and then we'll sort of discuss the controversy and this, the content of the controversy, and then as well as the story, the narrative of the controversy. I have here on the timeline kind of like two overlapping narratives that are about, let's say, Jewish feminism and changing, let's say Orthodox feminism, Jewish feminism, but there are two threads of this story that kind of overlap and go in different ways. One is the thread of education and Torah scholarship and the leadership that follows from that Torah scholarship, and the other trend is the trend of ritual participation and ritual leadership. And these two sort of don't always coincide, they don't always work in tandem. Maybe you can have one and not the other. Maybe, right, as we'll see, and I guess like in the 90s they used to say, like in Israel it's all about Torah scholarship and the leadership that follows Torah scholarship, whereas in America it's all about ritual innovation. And so maybe that's like a stereotype. That was sort of what was said. I think there's been some those narratives have gotten a little bit blurred. Those lines have melded in certain ways since then. So 1953, I have here on page 4. This is a letter that Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote to Rabbi Rosenfeld. Please accept my apologies for not answering your letter sooner. The delay was due to my overcrowded schedule. As to your question, with regards to a curriculum in a coeducational school, I expressed my opinion to you long ago that it would be a very regrettable oversight on our part if we were to arrange separate Hebrew courses for girls. Not only is the teaching of Torah Sheba'al Peh to girls permissible, but it is nowadays an absolute imperative. This policy of discrimination between the sexes as to subject matter and method of instruction, which is still advocated by certain groups within our Orthodox community, has contributed greatly to the deterioration and downfall of traditional Judaism. Boys and girls alike should be introduced into the inner halls of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's a very strong letter. Right? It's not about we can't have two schools. This is like a very, it's important for our, and it's not also about a watered down Torah Sheba'al Peh curriculum, that boys and girls should receive the same education in subject matter, in style of instruction. And it's sort of interesting that this letter's 1953, and that barely exists anywhere in the Orthodox school system, even more than half a century later, right? But that's what he calls for in this letter, and says that educational discrimination leads again to the downfall of Judaism. That girls see that they're not, they're having sophisticated math and science educations. They're having, and their Torah education is missing, right? He felt. why did I have wheat into quote? Oh, it wasn't. This was his son-in-law Wolkenfeld wrote this years later. But the same idea. If you, I suppose he was quoting or something, whatever. You can't talk about Judaism unless you study Talmud. That's what for him, for Soloveitchik, Judaism was defined as like Talmud, right? That's what it is. So to say that you know something about Judaism, to say that you're going to inculcate devotion to Judaism without imparting Talmud literacy is a joke. Because how could you possibly love Judaism if you can't study Talmud? What else is there, right? So that's maybe it's a narrow view of we might find exciting about Jewish life, but you understand why somebody who felt that way, like a great Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva, would feel that girls have to have identical Torah educations to boys, because you can't expect somebody to embrace Judaism if they don't know anything about Judaism. And to know something of significance about Judaism means to study Talmud in a serious way. Excuse me? Oh, it says right. I hope to prepare in the near future a halachic brief on the problem, which will exhaust the various aspects of the same. No, he never. He never did. I mean, we don't. If it did, we don't. It's lost. We don't have it. Yeah.
I got here a little late, so I'm sorry if you covered this already. But is the reason that, at least why Soloveitchik maybe had this position, is it sort of counter trends in America or something like that? We hope we're not living Judaism medically or something like that, and so it's the only way.
I mean, why is it necessary now as opposed to something being necessary
Right.
before? What's different about now?
Right,
So
exactly.
I think what's different, yeah. So I think, I don't precisely know. It could be something like now that girls are getting educations. Period. They need to have Jewish educations, and maybe somehow in the shtetl, Jewish life perpetuated itself without. And the truth is, most boys didn't get educations either, right? That's it. It was a very small number of people who got Talmudic educations. You had, most boys at age 14, whatever, they were apprenticed to the candle maker, and and there was a small number of intellectual or class elites who got to go to yeshiva and study Talmud. But in an era of mass education, where the idea is that Jewish commitment is perpetuated through education, something we talked about last class 2 weeks ago, right? So that girls have to be part of that as well. Yeah.
He seems in way to say, if you have a co-ed school, they should study together and they should study the same level. But if there's a separate boys' and
I imagine he would say that the girls' schools also then have to have a curriculum that's
and
equal
also
to
he's writing to Rabbi Young, his colleague, who's at the Jewish Center,
Yeah.
which didn't have a day school. It's not Ramaz or.
I don't remember. You can look up. This is from the collection of his letters. In the page before, you can see some of the context of who he was and why. I think Rabbi Rosenfeld was involved with a school in Long Island that he was founding. I don't remember it's in the page. It's not photocopied. It says more of the context of the letter. 1972, the first women's hakafot take place in Simchat Torah. They include Torah reading. Rabbi Riskin it was at Lincoln Square Synagogue. Rabbi Riskin tells a story. This is page 5 and 6. They came to him in Shmini Atzeret. They had this idea. They want to go up into the Beit Midrash, close the door, dance with the Sefer Torah, and read from it. It was Yontif already. Couldn't ask anyone. Couldn't confer with anyone. So he let them do it. You can see. Let's look at page 6. I was up the whole night poring over the Talmud, the codes, and the responsa pursuant to women carrying a Torah scroll and reading from it, severed from the presence of men. Ultimately, I concluded that all Talmudic sages and disciples agree that a Torah scroll cannot become ritually defiled, that a woman, even while menstruating, may touch, kiss, dance with, and read from a Torah scroll. I therefore met with them the following evening and told them that on Simchat Torah morning, I would allow them to lock the Beit Midrash door and conduct hakafot, as well as a Torah reading by women for women alone. I forbade the blessing over the Torah scroll because these special blessings had been established by our sages for the males who alone were obligated to hear the public Torah reading. However, I did rule that it would be permissible and even salutary to permit these religiously sincere and committed women to embrace and dance with the Torah to which they had become so personally committed on the day of rejoicing with the Torah. So it all worked, everything was great, worked very well, and then he writes, all hell broke loose. Okay? The rabbi of the West Side's Young Israel congregation, a revered Talmudic scholar, publicly announced that in his synagogue the following Shabbat, that if Lincoln Square Synagogue had allowed a women's hakafot and Torah reading, then Lincoln Square Synagogue could no longer be considered an Orthodox synagogue. So what did he do? page, okay? I immediately went to my Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik, in order to test the soundness of my ruling. I specifically requested that Mordechai Fierstein be present at the meeting in order to verify afterwards the exact words and nuances of the Rav's reply. I carefully explained the events leading up to my decision. I couldn't ask you, it was Yontif. I emphasized that there would be no problem admitting my mistake while still retaining my rabbinical position if it be his decision that I had ruled in error. The Rav could not have been warmer or more supportive. You are 100% covered halakhically, he said. He explained my predicament to be a political one in terms of what other Orthodox leaders would say who were not faced with the challenges of my particular congregation. And we talked about that in the first class, right? His congregation, it was a group of non-particularly religious Jews. They hired an Orthodox rabbi because it was cheaper, and eventually they agreed to put in a mechitza and become the synagogue, right? However, reiterated the Rav, the weight of recorded halachic opinion was certainly on my side. And then Rav Soloveitchik volunteered to give a shiur at Lincoln Square Synagogue, declaring, "Now I dare anyone to say that you and your synagogue are not Orthodox." And he did. For my own satisfaction, I continued to ask the same question of two other great Torah giants, whom I also looked up to as revered Torah teachers, Rav Moshe Feinstein, whom I went to see accompanied by a good friend of Dov Lesser, said that had I asked him beforehand, he would have told me not to allow it. Because although he felt that my ruling was halakhically correct, and I would be capable of limiting the feminist requests to halakhically permissible activities, others who might adopt these practices in their synagogues may not be able to control their scope. Nevertheless, he added that if were I not to allow a similar expression the next Simchat Torah, it would cause even one woman to leave Orthodoxy, I would be permitted to continue the religious activity for the women. Alan Lubavitcher Rebbe, after a far-reaching interview that dealt with many aspects of women in halakha and lasted for close to 2 hours, said in conclusion, not only may you do it next year, you must do it. I subsequently received a letter from the Rebbe that made it clear to me that his support for my position was limited specifically to my situation at Lincoln Square. So that, 1972, first Simchat Torah, first women's Torah reading. Also, 1972, Rav Soloveitchik gave the first, the inaugural shiur to the women's Beit Midrash program at Stern College, where we talked about that, I believe, as well, some other occasions. 1974, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who I think was at the time chief rabbi of Israel, he retired, I think he still was, wrote a private letter that he said not for publication, in which he endorsed the practice of women's Tefilah groups, again, a group of women who would pray together, one of them serving as a kind of chazan, skipping over things that require minyan, like Baruch Hu and Kedusha and Kaddish, and with a Torah reading. And according to this permissible, and he even said that it was fine for women to say the brachot before the aliyot when they read Torah, based on the understanding that women are Ashkenazi psak, that women can say a bracha for a mitzvah they're exempt from performing. Like a woman who takes lulav and etrog, the Ashkenazi position is she says a bracha, right? Asher kitshanu mitzvah tivanu al leishav besukara al ntilat lulav, because even though they're exempt, they're performing these mitzvot, they can say the bracha. That's the that's Rabbi Tom's position, and so they could also say the brachot for Torah reading. Later on, when the letter was publicized, he said, "Well, no, really that was only meant privately. I never meant to." He kind of walked back from it, but he sort of endorsed it. 1976 is when Midrash Lindenbaum opens. Rabbi Raviner's Yeshiva for Women. 1978, a women's Tefilah group begins regular meetings at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale in Rabbi Avi Weiss's shul. So they meet monthly, I think. Some Shabbat, they read Torah, they pray. 1979, Jewish Institute for Jewish Education opens, the first a full-time yeshiva program for women here in the United States. At an advanced level, they have a scholar circle, they give stipends for a three-year program. I don't know if the scholar circle started in 1979, maybe that came later, but they had classes, for women where they studied in Chavruta and in Beit Midrash, which didn't happen, it was really groundbreaking. 1984, 4 Roshei Yeshiva at Yeshiva University condemn women's minyanim. And I have here the letter.
Thank you for not calling it a response.
So, page 8, where it begins. This was a letter from Rabbi Louis Bernstein, who was the president of the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America at the time. He wrote to these Roshei Yeshiva and asked their opinion on women's Tefilah groups, and they give a number of reasons why they say it's forbidden. We were asked by Rabbi Eliezer Zalman Bernstein, president of the Rabbinical Council, for the following question: A few Orthodox synagogues have adopted the practice of hosting special Hagafot for women in Simchat Torah and women's prayer groups that include Torah reading and the reading of the Megillah. This is permitted or forbidden. These practices are forbidden for a number of reasons. First, since women do not count toward a religious quorum, the ritual is found to be a destructive institution, as there is neither the Chazarat HaShatz, Kaddish, Kedusha, nor the formal blessing that precedes the recitation of the Shema. Accordingly, none of these mitzvot are fulfilled in its entirety. Moreover, meaning, like the women, they're like missing out on Kedusha and Kaddish. Like if they go to shul, they'll get to hear, respond, take part in Kedusha, and respond to Baruch Hu and Kaddish. When they go to the women's minyan, they miss all that. Moreover, regarding the notion that these groups meet to form a minyan as if to demonstrate that they join together as a true quorum, this is a falsification of the Torah, ziyuf HaTorah. Second, this practice also reflects a complete and very apparent transformation of the tradition of our forefathers and an affront to the customs of Israel and a separation from the ways of the community, and specific, the considerable strictness that regards the custom of the synagogue. We don't just willy-nilly change ways that we worship and our practice things. Third, there is a concern that these practices are intended to emulate the ways of Gentiles, Chukat Goyim. We heard a great drasha about that this past Shabbat. Since these customs are derived from the feminist movement, a domain that is principally committed to elements of depravity, this in specific, according to the Nachmanides, violates the particular prescription against forming mitzvot according to their non-Jewish behavior. Owing to all these reasons, it appears to us that according to Jewish law, that all of these practices mentioned above are prohibited. It is forbidden to initiate them. In place of already enacted them, it is correct to abolish them for now and in the future. Pretty strong. It is well known that two great sages of our generation, to whom all of us and all our colleagues adhere, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik and Moshe Feinstein, both adamantly opposed all of these aforementioned ideas. The blessed is he who keeps the word, okay. And who signs it? Nissen Lippe Alper, Rabbi Braunspiegel, Rabbi Mordechai Willig, Rabbi Parnas, and Rav Herschel Schechter. Who didn't? So that's interesting. So let's first step, right? Who didn't sign it? Who didn't sign this letter? 4 Rosh Yeshiva Yeshiva University in 1984 signed this letter condemning these women's. Who did not sign? Soloveitchik did not sign. Okay, and that was, and they wanted him to sign, and he refused to sign because he felt this wasn't a halachic argument. This was like polemics. This was policy concerns, philosophical, hashkafic concerns. This was not a halachic like tshuva that he felt he could endorse. There was no, and he didn't feel it was formal isur. He didn't feel that these women's Tefilah groups violated a technical isur, and that he felt he couldn't sign. I was also told by someone who, knew him that he wanted to preserve it, like what he told Rabbi Riskin, that maybe in his synagogue it was necessary. Maybe in the particular challenges of trying to include women in Orthodoxy who did not grow up in Orthodoxy or had sort of wanted in this more active role in their ritual lives, maybe for synagogues like that, communities like that on the periphery of Orthodoxy, this needed to be an option for them, perhaps. But certainly he felt that there was no technical prohibition, and so he didn't sign, although he was solicited to sign. Moshe Feinstein, also we'll have to see what he had to say. Moshe Feinstein did write a letter condemning women's Tefilah groups, but the supporters of women's Tefilah groups felt that Moshe Feinstein's letter actually supported them. So we'll see the letter, we'll take a look at the letter in a few minutes. The reaction of the letter, so if you look at page 10, you can see, so this launched a whole controversy. Sorry.
I think it's not clear to me what that paragraph means. You're saying that they recognize that the Soloveitchik is not under two?
Well, the 4 Rosh Yeshiva are saying, well, so the Soloveitchik is against you and Moshe Feinstein is against you, so you shouldn't do this.
It's against you, the women's group?
Yes.
But isn't that not true?
Well, yes. I mean, it was. They thought. I don't know. They thought it was true.
Well, because they oppose all these ideas.
Meaning. Sorry.
Women's ideas means women's meaning?
Yeah. All of these aforementioned ideas, meaning women's. They were against feminism and against changing customs in the synagogue. They were against, women doing these things. Exactly. Yes.
You spoke before about witnessing this personally. I personally, as a member of Lincoln Square at this time in the mid-'80s, attended Shiurim with Rabbi Saul Berman, a close Talmid of Rabbi, which he never published. He said he wanted to write it in Hebrew, and he never did. But he excoriated the Reef 5. And he said that, as you just quoted, he said, this is not a responsum. This is not the way you write halakhic material. He said they were persuasive to him in one way, which was maybe it is true that there's an important principle of women attending shul and hearing and participating in these things when appropriate and beneficial. But it's perfectly
So
fine.
let's analyze their argument. Go back to page 1. They sort of make five. They make five different halachic arguments against women's tefillah. We'll sort of analyze them one at a time. So the first, it's an incomplete fulfillment of mitzvah, right? That women could go to shul with a conventional minyan, and they could respond to kedusha and take part in tefilah b'tzibur and etc. And they're forgoing that. And I think Schechter and Rabbi like at various writings, really, they're showing they don't care about God listening to them, right? Because if they really cared, they're going through, it's one thing if you're taking care of kids, or you're a little tired, or you're busy, and so you pray at home in your living room. But if you go through the trouble of getting up and getting dressed and going to shul, and then you choose not to pray with a minyan when you're there in shul, that shows your contempt for, you don't really care that God listens to you. Because if you did, you would daven with a minyan. I think Rabbi writes that. Yes, Tali?
Well, didn't we say before that it is clear that women can form a minyan from Megillah?
Yes.
So does this question include both Torah and
Yes.
Megillah?
Let's bracket Megillah. I would say it's not. I don't know. It's clear. I'd say it's discussed, though not entirely clear. And the Megillah question is a little more complicated.
They don't really address that at all.
In this letter, they don't. Rav Schechter addresses it elsewhere. I'd say I'm going to purposely bracket the Megillah question because it's both. It's more complicated and for the scope of this. Sarah wrote an article on women in Megillah reading, which was supposed to be published 3 years ago in time for Purim. It's with the printers, so we say, whatever. It'll be hopefully published in time for Purim 1 year. So,
Comes every year.
right, and Purim will be the only holiday, right? We go to Mashiach, so it'll be. So anyway, so they could go to shul, they could participate in these mitzvot in a full sense, but they're choosing not to. So that's a problem. So, any reactions? Yes, Luna.
This is like a new concept that, to me, I never thought women's tefillah would be in place of actual tefillah time. I always thought it was supplementary, at a random time, that's not really during an actual time.
Well, that's interesting. So let's say it's women's mincha. So we do here, we have a women's mincha in the early afternoon. It's a different time than the
Right.
conventional mincha. But even so, you'd say if a woman is going to say okay, I'm going to come to shul to daven mincha, why wouldn't I choose to go?
But it's supplementary, you could still go to the real one.
You're not going to daven mincha twice. You're not going to daven mincha twice. And I think, let's say this was taking place Shabbat morning. So let's say Shabbat morning,
And you don't have to go ever, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, so if you,
Never have to go.
so okay.
The assumption is that women are going to go to shul anyway, right? There isn't a recognition that a woman's minyan can track women who would otherwise go to shul.
Good. It also isn't. Yeah. So a few. Good. That's a good. I'd say a few. So, as we alluded to before, there are other halachic values that also can sometimes supersede praying with a minyan, like praying at sunrise or praying in a place that can enable greater kavanah. So it's not as if it's clear cut that prayer with a minyan is always that always trumps other values. In fact, for example, like praying at sunrise is maybe more important than prayer with a minyan. That's why I read the tshuva by young Rabbi or Yoni Rosenzweig wrote a tshuva where he says his recommendation for parents, fathers and mothers who want to take turns going to shul and take care of kids. He said, and he's reluctant to allow fathers to miss prayer with a minyan to enable their wives to say shachrit with a minyan. So he says instead, the husband should just pray at nates. They should pray at sunrise because that's equal to prayer with a minyan, and then they're done. At 7:30 Shabbos morning, they're done, and their wives can go to shul, and they've already prayed in as exemplary a way as had they gone to shul. So shalom, everyone, that's a way that it's very clever. So there are other values that are comparable to prayer with a minyan. So you can't say that why are you telling these women that it's terribly wrong if they miss this one opportunity once a month or once a week, whatever it is, to pray with a minyan. They're
saying they're doing Torah reading with full brachot and everything.
Say it again?
The only thing they're not doing is Kaddish.
Fine, so they're missing Kaddish Kedusha. So first of all, there's some poskim who say that the Ezrat Nashim, this is not Rav Schechter, thankfully, in these Rosh Yeshiva, but there are some poskim who say that the Ezrat Nashim is not part of the shul, and women are never prayed with a minyan, never can, because they're not in the shul. So that's one whole series of halachic thought this would not be relevant for. It is, again, indeed, Rav Schechter is acknowledging that women who come to shul are praying with a minyan, so that's important and valuable to keep in mind. But it's not possible. That's and I should have printed the letter. Somebody, what's her name? Somebody wrote a letter to tradition, also in the 90s, just about like, they say that like, we're forgoing this exemplary mitzvah of praying with him as if we could, as if it's possible for a woman who wants to daven with a minyan to do so. Like, how many shuls have women's sections that are open and unlocked with lights and chairs, right? A woman 3 times a day she's going to daven with a minyan, so if she is fortunate to live in Lakeview, that's fine, she can find space usually. But if she's, out there in the world, if she's in shuls in Israel, the women's section isn't open Shabbat afternoon. She's hanging out with friends, and the men get up to go to shul Shabbos afternoon. The women are staying around and schmoozing. Like, how's she gonna she's gonna get up and go off with the men to daven mincha, and then she'll get to shul, and the shul has no Ezra Nashim. The base Midrash where they go Shabbos afternoon doesn't even have a women's section, or maybe it has when the lights are off, or it's like used as a supply closet, or there are men davening there, right, et cetera, right? So it's not even it's something disingenuous, or almost I don't want to cast aspersions on their sincerity, but there's something very painful, I think, let's say, to read this letter if you're, from the perspective of a woman who wants to pray with a minyan and find that she can't. So, once a month, let her have a space that's just for her. Yeah.
In the 80s, I attended a couple times women's Tefilah and stood behind the mechitza. Because the main thing, and it was a weird. I think some may have changed this by now. She said that they do Torah reading with brachot, but they said the brachah before the Torah reading for each aliyah, having not said it earlier. And the repetition. This is not what happened at Beit Yaakov.
There are different
practices. That woman didn't say. We'll talk about. Which is kind of a weird amalgam.
We'll talk about. There are different practices, and because that you had because you had the opposition of these Rosh Yeshiva, and you didn't have anyone with real authority over the entire movement saying this is how it's done and this is how you do it correctly. So there are many different the shuls that allowed it. Different shuls had different practices, and we can discuss the theories behind each one. The other opposition, misrepresentation of the Torah, right? They say it's false. It's right. Participants in the women's Tefilah group appear as though they're engaged in the mitzvah of Kriyat Torah, or as though they're praying with the minyan. They're not. It's falsifying the Torah. But misrepresentation can't occur when you're not actually violating Jewish law, right? If you're doing something permissible, you're not misrepresenting right? If you're doing permissible things, you're praying as a group, you're reading from the Torah. That's a permissible thing to do. Torah scrolls are suitable tools for Torah study. And so you're not misrepresenting anything. And in fact, right, once upon a time that was the only tool for Torah study, right? And and even Ziyafat Torah, they're falsifying the Torah. There are occasions where we do that actually, like old books used to be printed with things in the front cover. Used to say, like halachic books would say, all the references to Gentiles that appear in this book refer only to the ancient Greco and pagans, but not to our beloved Russian brothers and sisters who we live together with in peace and harmony. And all references to all the times in this halachic book it talks about conversion to Judaism, that only applies to places where it's permissible, right? Not to right, etc. All references to tyrants, of course, don't refer to the czar whom we love, right? And these were printed on the front covers of many Svarim in as a way to just get through the censor, right? So we sometimes do actually falsify the content of the Torah. But the more if you're doing something permissible, you're not falsifying as acting as though we're sort of presenting something which is forbidden as though it's permissible. No, you're just doing something permissible. And you see this as well in the language, right? The detractors always refer to women's minyan, right? It's the women's minyanim. And the proponents always say, no, it's a women's Tefilah group. We're not a minyan. We're not pretending to be something we aren't. We're very clear about these halachic distinctions. We're a women's Tefilah group. And if you just pay attention to the language, the detractors always call it a women's minyan, and the proponents always say women's Tefilah group.
The most important challenge is this idea of foreign philosophy.
Hold on, we'll get number 3. Okay. Splitting a community, V'rov am hadrat melech. Okay, right? There's an ideal. There's a hidur mitzvah. It's an enhancement of rituals if they should be done in large groups. This is why at a big Shabbos meal, one person should make kiddush on behalf of the whole table, rather than everyone make his or her own individual kiddush. So better to have one big minyan than lots of small shuls, lots of small minyanim. So first of all, we already said again that's one enhancement. That's one hidur of the mitzvah of purpose. There are others, and like praying at sunrise or praying in a place where you can have greater kavanah and. Don't tell me if you have a Shkama minyan, you have a Young Professionals minyan, and you have the late minyan, whatever, that this is going to be, that some of those are all okay, and you have the Hasidic breakaway shul and the Sephardi minyan. Don't tell me that a women's Tefilah group is a problem with Rov Hadra Melech, it's dividing the community, somehow, can't only be a problem when women do it and not a problem when others do it. 4, departure from custom and norms. We don't make changes, especially in the realm of the synagogue life. So, lack of evidence is not evidence of a lack, okay? It's not that there was the prerequisites for women with the kind of Torah education to enable a women's Tefilah group with Torah reading. And the group of women with the interest in praying together in this way didn't exist before, let's say, the 1970s and 80s. And so you can't say that its absence before then was a deliberate decision not to do something. It just never came up as something that anybody would want to do, right? So lack of evidence is not evidence, but the fact that it didn't happen before doesn't mean that there was a decision that our custom is against us, we're opposed to this. In halakhic language, lo inu raya or lo inu enu raya, right? So do we say that this thing doesn't exist, so that is proof that it shouldn't happen, or not? And even if we say that the fact that it doesn't exist means it shouldn't happen, the classic case of this is that Ashkenazi women don't shecht animals because, and seems no one did it, so okay, I guess they can't, even though in theory they could and should, or could. So lo inu raya, the fact that it doesn't happen, that seems to be proof that there must be some halachic argument against it, but that would only apply if there's a deliberation, not if it's the possibility never presented itself, the desire never presented itself. It's a new phenomenon. And really the women's Tefilah groups are taking advantage of the fact, halachic texts were written by men, mostly about men, and so what women do amongst themselves, it's almost like this blank space in the halachic map of life, women amongst themselves without men involved, that's not, it's almost not really a subject of halacha, right? Of halachic adjudication, I'd say, right? I'm pushing the part a little bit too far, but that is sort of the advantage of the kind of sort of sails through this sort of blank space in halacha, because really women amongst themselves is really not something that's discussed much in halachic literature. And again, there is a precedent for most or all the innovations of women's Tefilah, like using a Torah scroll for study, I think in Morocco maybe happened, and women in schools praying with a chazanit, etc. Finally, imitating Gentile mores, chukot hagoyim, women's prayer groups that imitate non-Orthodox movements, inspired by feminism. So, first of all, it's not actually true. There aren't Gentiles who have women's Tefilah groups, right? It isn't actually what?
My neighbor is Lutheran. They have a women's prayer group.
Right. Do they say the Amidah?
No.
Do they read from a Torah scroll or read the Midrash? No. Right. Exactly. Right. So and that's what I meant. Right. It isn't actually a non-Jewish custom to engage in these activities. And furthermore, it seems that in Henkin's language, the Torah does not forbid movements but actions. Okay, that this concept of chukot hagoyim really refers to practices, things that one does, not ways of thinking, and it's very hard, from the, not that anyone speaks, from the, I find that all of these sort of, motivated by this, motivated by that, I find those arguments to be very problematic because, who knows what someone's motivated by? I mean, how can you? There is no Archimedean point, separate from ideology, separate from influences, where you could say, this is pure, this is not. Everyone has influence of something, right? So it's if I'm guilty of interpreting the Torah as a 21st century American, what am I supposed to interpret the Torah as a 16th century Russian? I can't. That's not an option for me. So I can only interpret the Torah based on who I am and my life, and I think the influences go both ways. Yeah.
Can you give an example of something that was probably avoided because of this way?
Celebrating Halloween is something that I think is appropriate to avoid because of this prohibition. Certain types of
clothing. The Hasidim don't reverse their button side.
I don't know if that's. I think it's Kabbalistic reasons. I thought it's Kabbalistic reasons.
That's how it's going.
I'm not sure. I think it's a Kabbalistic Gvura over the right over Chesed over Jin. There's a lot. Everyone writes about this. It's a major subject of halachic adjudication. I mean, again, the drasha on Shabbat, with the example of whether it's permissible for doctors to wear white robes, is that a forbidden Gentile practice? You see discussions about, I think Halloween would be a good example case of being prohibited for this reason.
Hippocratic oath?
No, I don't recall. It's a lot of literature. It's a major lucky topic. This comes up. There's a long tshuva by the Sridei Eish, Hillel Yaakov Weinberg, where he permits bat mitzvah celebrations. And this is what he contends with. Is this also motivated by feminism? It's a desire to want to make equal. This is not a Torah ideology, and he permits it. And that would be a great long tshuva about grappling through some of these issues. Very kind of similar, but a little bit different. Okay. So that's the argument. So if you look at page 10 in your packets. So this is from Zev Elif's textbook. Okay, November 1984, Louis Bernstein of Republicans of America debated with Rabbi Avi Weiss on the topic of women's prayer in the latter's Riverdale Synagogue. The public event drew many interested parties. Bernstein dismissed women's prayer groups as a fleeting trend, while Weiss pushed for its permanence in Orthodox Jewish life. After the debate, a group of women wrote to the president of the RCA to share with Bernstein their impressions of the Riverdale affair. They described Bernstein's remarks as demeaning and presumptuous, and his selection of rabbinic authorities as unbalanced. The letter writers therefore asked Bernstein to open up the halakhic discussion to other prominent modern Orthodox leaders, like Rabbi Saul Berman. Below is Bernstein's response. He basically said, "Listen, I can do whatever I want. I'm the president of the RCA. I can ask the people I want to ask. If you want to ask Rabbi Berman, that's great. Go ahead. Go ask him. That's fine." And he says, "It's clear to me that you are unaware that Rabbi Herschel Schechter has prepared an exhaustive response, which should be available in a few days. It explains the position of the Rosh Yeshiva in great detail." So, meaning this little short letter was eventually expanded into a longer tshuva of Schechter, which is published in his Sefer, his first Sefer. He takes basically these 5 arguments expanded. I think there were 2 versions. One version casts really negative aspersions on the women and their motives and their insincerity. I think he softened that language in a later version of the tshuva. I know somebody who knows somebody, so it's a second degree knowledge of a woman who says that she carries a photocopy of the tshuva in her pocketbook to look at every time she is tempted to become Orthodox again. And this reminds her when she's not.
Wait, of Rav Bernstein?
No, Rav Schechter's tshuva on women's Tefilah, which takes the arguments of the Rosh Yeshiva, those 5 arguments, and expands them with more, with fleshing them out in greater length. Rivka Haut was the leader of the Women's Tefilah Network, which sort of formed again since 1985, responding to Rabbi Bernstein. And there was a series of articles in Jewish newspapers in 84, 85. And if you look, it's like she's describing women's Tefilah, what it's about, what it does. Look at page 11, just at this point, she says, what exactly are the part that I bracketed? What exactly are women's prayer groups? They consist of groups of women who meet regularly, in most cases once a month on Shabbat, to conduct prayer services. These groups are no minyanim, though they have been persistently and erroneously called so by many rabbis. Okay, that's the point I was making before, that as a way to detract from them, they call them minyanim, when the women who pray this way are very, very careful not to call themselves minyanim. And she describes how they work and what they do. Okay. Page 12, Rabbi Lezer Berkowitz, he had been in Chicago at the yeshiva for a number of years. He retired to Israel in 1985. He writes, in response to reading about the letter of the Rosh Yeshiva, page 12 is the right-hand side. "Sir, I read with great interest your article of September, Orthodox women, female rabbis. One may no longer remain silent. I have read carefully the response of the 5 Talmudists at Yeshiva University forbidding prayer services by women. I wish to say unequivocally that their tshuva has nothing to do with halakha. People will have to realize that knowledge and understanding are not identical. One may know a lot and understand very little. There may be a great deal of orthodoxy around. Unfortunately, there is only very little halachic Judaism. May God grant to the women of Women's Tefilah Network strength and courage to continue their efforts to the best of their abilities." That's pretty strong. So Eliezer Berkowitz, strong proponent of Women's Tefilah. Go back to our timeline. 1988, Leah Shaktiel in Israel sues to join a local religious council, and she does join the local religious. I think she moved to Arad or somewhere. No, not Arad. Maybe Yerucham. Some small development town. This was a movement of religious Zionists who, instead of moving out to the territories, decided they would move to instead of going to empty hilltops in the West Bank, we'll go to poor cities in Israel and create networks of religious Jews and with stable middle class families, and bring like sort of be sort of, bring a community up around us. And so she joined a religious council and after winning her suit in the Supreme Court. 1990, there's a Toanot Beit training program established by Rabbi Riskin. This trains women to advocate for women in the Beit system in Israel when, in cases of divorce. 1990, Rabbi Avi Weiss publishes Women at Prayer. That's a short book-length defense of women's Tefilah groups. I have some extras of that book. Page 14, we have the title page. Looks very 1990. You can see that this is the title page. And I think we'll look at a few pages from his book on page 15 of your packets where he talks about the Beit and Moshe Feinstein, okay? Because that was raised before. So, the most troubling component of the contemporary debate of women's prayer groups has been the misleading use of the appeal to the authority of our generation's Torah scholars. And behold, it is well known that the two great sages of our generation, to whom all of us turn, right? We read this already, are opposed to women's minyanim. Okay, both these two Torah scholars had ample opportunity to publicly condemn such groups, and they very carefully held back from any isur, and always held open the real possibility of these groups functioning within the halachic community. Okay, so the Beit was alive and somewhat active in 1984. Moshe Feinstein was alive in 1984. They didn't sign the letter. They didn't issue a prohibition. So let's see what Rabbi Weiss says. In the early 1970s, the Beit indicated to some rabbis that under certain guidelines, women's Tefilah groups are permitted. On one occasion, the Rav carefully detailed the format of women's Tefilah groups and suggested substitute text for the Devarim Shebekdusha that women would omit in their prayer groups. Some have claimed that in recent years, the Beit, concerned about fragmentation with the Jewish community, has been less forthcoming. Nevertheless, the Rav has never objected to women's prayer groups on halachic grounds. This is not to say that the Rav had never been quoted as objecting to a specific practice of these groups, but opponents have unfortunately been willing to generalize these objections and cast them as total opposition to women's prayer groups. For example, Rabbi Moshe Meiselman outlined the procedure whereby some women's prayer groups allow the personal Birkat Torah to be said out loud before the reading from the Sefer Torah. He then notes that my revered teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, has told me that he is opposed to such aliyot and has never told any rabbi that they are permitted. Yet Rabbi Kenny Alman remarked, long before the current controversy, Rabbi Moshe Meiselman quotes his revered teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, as being opposed to women's prayer groups. That's not what he said, right? See the difference? Rabbi Meiselman himself, no fan of these groups, was careful to indicate that the opposition was only to a specific form, the recitation of blessings before and after Torah reading, but he is quoted by others as the authority presenting the Rav's opposition to the groups per se. So the Soloveitchik did not seem to think there was a technical isur. It seems that he thought they were a bad idea, and over time his opposition seems to have strengthened, but he never claimed that they were totally forbidden, and that was, in general, that was not... Soloveitchik worked that way. He would, he wanted his students to think for themselves. And if they came with questions, he would ask, what do you think? And the students would present their halachic reasoning, and he would say either I agree or I disagree. But he didn't say something was usur unless he really felt it was asur, right? He could say it was a bad idea, he would say it was a bad idea. As an example here, if you look at the footnote 39, this is on page 111. The letter written to Mr. Yudson is dated 1989. Rabbi Shapiro, like the other Torah scholars, women's Tefilah groups are not halachically prohibited. Their concern relates to the realm of public policy. Will women's Tefilah groups fragment the community? Are they conducted by sincere women? Do they have any value? Leaving it to each rabbi to decide whether these services permissible on purely halachic grounds are appropriate for his community. For this writer, the distinction between public policy and a binding halachic opinion became clear in a related discussion I had with Soloveitchik concerning the carrying of the Sefer Torah by women through the Ezrat Nashim. In conversation with the Rav, I asked whether he felt this was prohibited. I remember the Rav's response with great clarity, don't do it. I then asked, but Rebbe, are you saying it is asur? The Rav answered, I didn't say it's asur, it's mutter, but I want to protect you. Here again, the Rav's don't do it was not a halachic psak, but an expression of concern which in this case the Rav felt would protect me, but a suggestion which was certainly not halachically binding and one which I have respectfully chosen not to follow. And they, people have used this footnote as this sign of outrageous chutzpah on the part of Rabbi Weiss. From what I've heard from others, I think that Rav Soloveitchik didn't want Hasidim. He wanted to educate thinking people. He understood that rabbis need some autonomy to provide appropriate halachic guidance for their communities with their unique constellations. Yes?
So based on this, it seems like it's being presented as if Rabbi Soloveitchik's objection was that it would cause controversy, would be dangerous for this.
Yeah, he also was he was very traditional. He didn't like changing shul minhag, as we know, right? He was very, very, very conservative about shul minhag, right? So he was against writing keynote for the Holocaust. He was against ritual commemoration of Yom Ha'atzmaut. He was very, very conservative when it came to anything having to do with the synagogue and ritual, other than the innovations he made in this, but he was very, very conservative about those types of things, and that was also a piece of it. I think he was a conservative person in general. I think he was very alarmed by feminism and what he saw happen in the 70s and 80s in that regard. So in terms of Moshe Feinstein, just here's you can see on page 16, just the letter, the translation of Moshe Feinstein's letter. In reality, it is hard to find a situation where this problem of women whose motivation is insincere does not exist. Therefore, it's hard for us to say that any women's minyan does not have this problem. And only in the theoretical realm itself can one say that if there is a group of righteous women whose intentions is purely for the sake of heaven, without intending to undermine God's Torah or Jewish practice, then of course, why prevent them from praying together? And if they also read from the Torah scroll, provided they take care not to do it in such a way that one might erroneously believe that it be actually a public reading, that is, they should not say the Torah blessings in public out loud, they should either rely on the blessings which they said earlier, or in the event that they have not yet said the blessings, they may say them to themselves. There are, of course, additional details included in our Igrit Moshe, which one should be careful note in this matter. Each Baal Hara'ah should conduct himself in this matter in a way which is in line with this outlook. So Moshe felt this is like motivated by insincere women, it's a feminist agitation, it shouldn't happen, but theoretically there's nothing wrong with it. So Rabbi Weiss and the Women's Tefilah Network felt, therefore, we're sincere. We're not motivated by a desire to undermine tradition. We're sincere women trying to serve God better, and so it's permissible. And so Rosh Hashanah and Moshe Feinstein, for the detractors of Women's Tefilah, are on their side, and for the proponents, they're also on their side. Both of them are really against it, I think, in practice, but I think technically, is it usher, is what these women are doing, is it forbidden? I don't, Moshe and Rav, I think, really say it's not. And that's I think a distinct position. And Eliezer Berkowitz, of course, was a proponent. Berman, Saul Berman, Shlomo Riskin, Rabbi Weiss, they were all proponents and felt it was very appropriate. And that's like sort of. And Rabbi Goren, who wrote this tshuva in 1974, very lenient, but then he walked it back. He didn't want to it was not the hill he was going to die on. It's highlight. Okay, let's get a little bit late, I think. Yeah, so let me just take a few more minutes just to wrap things up. Let's go back to our timeline, just moving things along. 1997, the Vad Rabbeinu, there's a girl invited as a member of the Young Israel. Okay, give me 5 minutes. We started at 8:05, so I have until 9:07. Okay. It's a girl who is a member of the Young Israel of Hillcrest in Queens. She celebrates her bat mitzvah in a women's tefillah group, and she invites her friends who are members of other shuls, and this becomes a public thing. The Queen's Vad gathers a meeting to discuss this. Rabbi Krauss, Simcha Krauss, who's the rabbi at the time of the Israel Hillcrest, he shows up, and I know he told me, he said, I came prepared to debate halacha and with sources, and he was going to give shir and explain, and no one was interested, and they voted to condemn, and they issued a public statement condemning, saying, don't go to the bat mitzvah, this is not appropriate, this shouldn't happen. That was 1997. I have in your packet, you have a public ad that the Women's Tefilah Network took out in some newspapers on page 19, responding to the Queen's Vad. 1997 is also when the first JOFA conference on feminism and Orthodoxy took place in New York, massive conference. 1997, founding of
Window. Because of the battle of the Queen.
Yeah, it was like everyone was like, this is an issue that like modern Orthodoxy is coalescing around, that we're not the Queen's Vad, this is an alliance of synagogue rabbis, like modern Orthodox synagogue rabbis are endorsing women's tefillah groups. There's the grassroots network of the Women's Tefillah Network. There's, and then JOFA is formed in that year with a lot of involvement from congregational rabbis, modern Orthodox congregational rabbis. 1997, the Migdal Oz Beit Midrash for Women is founded. 1997, the Columbia Barnard students create a daily women's tefillah group. And if you went to college, if you were a college with an Orthodox, like a large Orthodox undergraduate population in the 90s, or even into 2000s or 2002, there was a women's tefillah group at your college campus. Okay, so Columbia Barnard, Penn, Harvard.
Daily?
Not daily, but it existed. It was right when you were. Was there a women's tefillah group at Penn when you were there? Oh, it was like once a year. Yeah. Right. Okay. So that,
That's a group.
no, well, yes, but no, meaning that's a sign that you're after, it's like it's like a generation later. In the 90s, like if you would, like I think, I'm sure that existed more frequently before. 1997, Nishmat founds the Yoetzot Halacha program. 1997, Julie Stern Joseph and Sharona Margville and Halakman are hired as congregational interns at Lincoln Square Synagogue and HIR, Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. 1998, there are an estimated 60 women's Tefilah groups meet regularly around the world. It's like a peak, okay? 60, North America, Europe, Israel, 60 women's Tefilah groups meet. So how often do they meet? Once a week, once a month, 4 times a year, maybe only for a bat mitzvah, but associated with the synagogue or the neighbor, But there are 60 groups that meet occasionally, let's say, okay? All over the world. 1998, there's a book published, Jewish Legal Writings by Women. 1998, Aryeh Frimer and Doe Frimer published the Women's Prayer Services Theory and Practice, a long, long letter articulating that, the basis for a lot, what are the arguments against, what are counter arguments, what did Reb Soloveitchik think about it, and get to the heart of the matter. And they supported women's Tefilah groups. 1999, the first ADOC conference on Orthodoxy and modernity takes place. So there's JOFA conferences, there's ADOC conferences, alternating years, big conferences funded by Kushner, right? I think. 1999, YCT Rabbinical School is founded. Again, building off of this, there's a need to reclaim modern Orthodoxy because, again, there's this congregational rabbis with this network of women who are their allies have this practice and it's permissible, but it's being opposed by the Rosh Yeshiva, and so we need a new yeshiva. We need new institutions that are going to defend this. And so it really, I think the struggle over women's Tefilah groups really defined how modern Orthodoxy situated itself in the 90s. And then it all sort of falls apart. 2001, Mendel Shapiro writes Kriyat Torah by Women, a halachic analysis, which paves the way for the 2002 founding of Shura Chadashah as the first partnership minyan in Jerusalem.
Leader Union was a little.
That's true. That's true. It's true. It was much smaller, I believe, and that will take us into next week, and we'll see how things fall apart and where we are today. I guess I guess I should say something about just my feelings about women's Tefilah group. It is 9 to 7 already, so maybe if you can stay for 3 more minutes, I'll sort of say just my own editorial comment. So what's great about women's Tefilah groups, from what I've been told, is that, and what I've seen, is that they enable women to engage in Tefilah with a seriousness and a joy and a sense of community, which is really hard for women to experience in an Orthodox synagogue setting. And that is really enhancing and empowering and exhilarating for many women to lead a group of peers in Tefilah. A lot of men get to enjoy that from time to time, if they are so inclined, and that's something otherwise unavailable to women in Orthodox synagogue setting. Certainly, learning how to lane and to read from a Torah scroll, that's a tremendous way to study Torah. Right? That's you read you have to connect the written Torah to the cantillations, which the Torah Shval Peh, the way it's supposed to sound. That's a very deep internalization of the words of Torah. I don't lane very much, as you may know, but the sections that I do, I know really, really well. I know it in a way that I know no other sections of Torah. And for women to have the ability to, learn sections of Torah in that deep way, I think is very, very valuable, very enhancing. Connects them to the great Masorah that we've been learning how these words are supposed to sound. We've been reading them to one another for thousands of years. It also enables women to appreciate, I think, being in shul, like the regular shul, the other times of the year, because they understand what's going on. Right? I think a lot of when Sarah has taught Masechet Megillah to the prakim that talk about how Torah is read and maftir and haftarah and hag, a lot of when she's taught that to women, they have no idea what goes on in shul sometimes, because it's but if you have a chance to hold the Torah scroll and open it up and this is how it's read and this is how you treat it, and it can enable one to feel more connected to what happens and a spillover effect into the rest of one's prayer life in a community. I think that I guess the strength is also the halachic strength of finding that middle path, taking advantage of the fact that what women do with other women is like a halachic, like neutral zone, that's enabled this practice to like find a way to be halachically permissible and really innovative and let women do these things they couldn't otherwise do. But it also kind of, I think, it's also a fatal weakness of this form of prayer. It's probably why it almost doesn't exist anymore. After being so strong a generation ago, because it's contrived and it's kind of fake, and sometimes, depending on how they do it, that's not all as fake, right? Sometimes it's, they really go out of their way to make what they do as similar as possible to what men do in a conventional Tefilah gathering, and other times they're more free to move a little bit farther away from that and not mimic what men do, and sort of just, let's think of something that's authentically our own as a group of women praying together. Maybe that's a little bit stronger, or that withstands that sense of being contrived. So that's sort of maybe why it really didn't actually have a staying power. Although we still have it occasionally here, and and I think for the people who participate, it's valuable. Although,
it somewhat vindicates the Reitz 5 Alti Groshma Tzibur, that the separation.
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. We'll talk about this next week. I'm not sure. I wonder if they wouldn't. I don't know. I mean, we'll talk about it next week, because I think maybe next week. And I think that's what to say about.
Why it doesn't exist?
No, we'll talk about that next week also. So I guess I guess I'll say it seems that it has great potential value. I think it meant a lot to many people over a period of many years. But the strength was also its weakness. The way in which it was able to exist halachically made it very vulnerable to a new generation finding it inauthentic and finding other things more compelling. But again, we still have it here, and I guess if you participated, you can comment, to me or amongst yourselves at what you find compelling, what you find not compelling about it. But it defined a generation, I think, of our community's efforts to kind of work through some big issues about rabbinic autonomy. Who should be, is it congregational rabbis or Rosh Yeshiva? Is it, grassroots women doing things, or, do we defer to great poskim? How do we, is feminism a poisonous ideology? There's no place in our community, or is there a way to partner with feminism to enhance, religious commitment amongst many people? And I guess, I'm not going to talk about it or read inside. The final pages, page 20 and 21 of your books are from our book by Joel Welski, where he makes the comparison. He sort of focuses on that weakness of being contrived and says something can be permissible and contrived and therefore silly. And he endorses women's Tefilah groups, but says they should really try to move away from trying to mimic what men do and be something authentically themselves and different. He makes an interesting analogy, which you can read on your own if you wish to. I think we'll pause here. Thank you so much. And next week we'll bring things up to 2017. So thank you.